It was so thick I could only see 20 feet ahead. Headlights were useless slabs of grey. The world shrank to a rectangle of wet light and nothing else. That's when I saw the first figure standing in the fog, like someone had set a silhouette out in the middle of the highway and left it there to test me. I'm telling you 3 true stories tonight, things I either lived through myself or heard from people I trust, all tied together by the same trick the fog plays. It steals your bearings and leaves you facing something that shouldn't be there. One of them happened to me on Highway 101 in 2022. The other 2 involve a college runner getting lost inside the trees and a morning on Willipa Bay that ended with footprints leading out of the surf and right up to an abandoned rowboat. Every one of these moments started ordinary. A drive, a run, a paddle, and turned into something that didn't fit any explanation I could hold on to. I'm the kind of person who pays attention to weather. I grew up where you learn to read a sky the way others read a clock. So when fog rolls in, I notice the way it eats sound and light, the hush it lays over everything, the way distances compress and the world becomes an excuse to misread the obvious. That's why these stories stuck with me. They aren't your standard jump-scare campfire tales. They left traces that couldn't be waved away as nerves. You'll hear the physical evidence in a minute. A dented rear bumper with no paint transfer, GPS numbers that kept ticking even when the runner stopped moving, footprints slick with salt water that came straight from the tide and walked inland. Those details are why I kept asking questions long after my hands stopped shaking. If you like real creepy stories, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest. Stick with me. The second one gets under your skin in a different way, and the third will make you rethink the idea that water is a border between us and whatever else is out there. Story 1. Highway 101, 2022. I was driving north on 101, coming back from Eureka toward the Bay Area. It was late enough my eyelids were heavy, and my brain was beginning to insist on sleep. The road is 2 lanes there, close to the coastline, everything flattened into that endless Northern California drip of cedar and fog. I'd done that stretch 100 times, at all hours. Familiar roads don't make you safer, they make you careless. The fog started thick and honest, the kind that wraps around your mirrors and keeps the trees as ghost outlines. My wipers beat a steady tempo against the drizzle. The dash clock read something like 2 a.m. The highway was empty, or at least it felt empty. There were other cars now and then, headlights like distant stars, but mostly it was me, my car's engine, and the soft scrape of tires on wet asphalt. The first time I saw him, I thought he was a hitchhiker. He was standing at the edge of the lane, just far enough off the shoulder that I wouldn't have to swerve. I remember thinking, I hope he's okay. Then thinking I should keep going because it's 2 a.m. and you don't pick up strangers at 2 a.m. And the fog makes every human look like a decision you have to live with. He was in the middle of the fog then, somehow in the center of my focus. A figure in dark clothing, standing like a sentry. He didn't move as I passed. I told myself I'd seen him, and that was that. I blinked, and he might have been gone into a blur of grey. Maybe he stepped off the road. Maybe I'd misjudged the distance. Maybe my tired brain was handing me the easy script. People walking late, fog, roads. I kept going. But an hour later, because it was a long drive and I was pushing through the middle of the night tunnel of exhaustion, I saw him again. Not the same spot, not even the same mile marker. He stood there again at the roadside, this time closer to my lane. He was exactly where you would be if you expected traffic and wanted to be noticed. My stomach dropped because 2 sightings don't line up if this is an ordinary person on foot. The stretch between them was 20 minutes of highway and a few corners. People don't teleport. I slowed. He didn't step away. He didn't wave. He just watched the cars as they passed, and he watched me when I slowed down enough for his face to sharpen from shadow. There was a long blink in my head, that split second where I tried to give myself a rational life preserver. Maybe he was walking along the shoulder. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe he was trying to flag someone. I considered pulling over. I didn't. I told myself that pulling over at 2 a.m. on 101 in the fog was asking for trouble in a different way. So I kept driving, but now every shadow around the road was a potential hazard. The third sighting was the one that replayed in my head for months. I had decided to pick up speed, to outrun the sense of being watched, because that logic felt better than the other logic. Pull over. ask what's up, get stuck listening to someone tell you their story. The fog pressed in like a damp hand on the hood. About a mile down the road there was a curve that swallows headlights and spits them back as slices of white. As I rounded it, there he was again, as only this time he seemed to be in the road. Not just near the road. He was standing in the lane directly in front of me. My foot slammed the brake and the car protested with a high, wet scream of rubber. For a breath, everything stopped. My pulse in my throat, the fog like a wall, the hood of my car barely clearing the outline of him. He looked at me. Really looked. Not the sideways glance of someone trying to gauge whether they'll accept a lift, but a steadied gaze, like two people measuring each other's weight. I could see his face. He was a man, mid-30s maybe, hood up, the fog beading on his eyelashes. His eyes caught the light from my headlights, and there it was. The sense of recognition that did not belong to me. He looked like he had been waiting for me. I don't know how long we held that stare. Time folds when you're trying to do the math between flight and fight. I thought about slamming the car into reverse and burning rubber out of there. I thought about the idea of driving forward, hoping he would flinch. I thought about calling the cops right then, but my hands were too steady on the wheel, and my phone was a risky offering to the wet night. Then, without warning, another car appeared behind me. Not an approaching light in the distance, a dark mass of metal that had somehow pulled up. The sound was a sudden crush, the way a ball hits a wall. My back seat erupted in the metallic echo of impact, and for a moment the world was the cold scent of airbags and the shocking compression of my seatbelt. The man in the lane stayed where he was. He didn't move. The car behind me had hit the rear of my vehicle hard enough that my whole frame shuddered forward. I sat there for a second, stunned, the engine idling, the fog muffling everything into a low, unkind quiet. Then I looked back. There was no driver behind me. No lights that stayed on, no scene like in the movies. The rear bumper had a dent, a long, deep curve across the trunk. You could feel it with your hand. But when I stepped out and ran my fingers along the metal, pushed through the paint with nails to see if there was any transferred paint from another car, there was nothing. No copper, no grey, no fleck of another vehicle's color. Just bare metal compressed inward where something had struck it. I called 911. Or maybe I called a non-emergency number. My memory knows I called and told someone a car had hit me from behind on 101 and that I was shaken and needed to know what to do. They told me to stay where I was if I could and wait for an officer. I waited, wrapped my jacket tighter, watching the fog swallow and spit out the taillights of cars that passed beyond the curve. When the deputy got there, I relayed what happened. I told him about the man standing in the fog. I told him the thing that made me feel sick, that the man had made me feel boxed in. He listened with the kind of face people put on when they have to file reports for things they can't easily explain. He wrote what I told him. He took pictures of my rear bumper and looked at the dent through a flashlight. He said things like, "We'll enter this as a report," and "Did you get any plates?" and "Any cameras nearby?" I had none of that. I had a dent, and I had my own memory. Later, at home, lying in bed, I turned the event over like a coin in my hand. Hallucination, sleep deprivation, a prank, these were all the hypotheses I offered myself, one by one, as if the right answer could be pieced together from logic alone. But the dent didn't care about my theories, it was a physical fact. I could trace the indentation with my palm and feel the coolness of the unbroken paint around it. There was no paint transfer, no scratch of anyone else's color. No residue that would suggest a trailer hitch or a bizarre object. Just an impact that dented my metal in the exact shape of a blunt force, as if something heavy had slammed into the bumper with the force of momentum but had not carried paint. How do you square that with the fact that there were no other cars in sight? How do you reconcile a depth of physical contact and the absence of material exchange? You count up the possibilities. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was a hidden hazard. A fallen tree branch. Maybe the person standing on the road had been hit and the driver fled. Those are tidy explanations that want badly to be true, but they don't sit right with what I saw. The man standing there, the steady eye contact and what felt like intention. I have replayed the entire stretch of highway in my head, mile by mile. I know where the curves bite. I know where the shoulders are narrow and how the fog pockets deep in certain hollows. That knowledge offered comfort and also horror. The road conspired with the fog to make you believe you could see farther than you could, and to make you think the leftover shapes were permanent. For a while after that night, I found myself driving with my hazard lights on more often. I caught myself scanning the shoulders like a hunter. Sometimes when the fog comes in, my hands go to where I left the phone on the seat, wondering if my world will suddenly need evidence to stand. I asked around. I told friends, family, a few co-workers. People have stories, of course. Oh yeah, there's always people walking that stretch. Or maybe someone kicked your bumper with a blunt object just as you drove past. Or you were tired, man. That's all. One person said the deputy must have seen something similar there before. Another shrugged it off and suggested vandalism. I pressed the deputy on whether he'd seen that kind of dent before. He said nothing definitive, just that he'd take the report. There was no official conclusion offered to me that night, no neat resolution. The dent remained in my bumper for months, a mute accusation attached to my car every time I pulled into a parking lot. People like clear endings. I wanted to fold this into a story I could live with. A drunk driver, no doubt, a prankster, an errant load on a pickup. But you can't press a hole into reality and then glue it back together with wishful thinking. The dent was there. The figure was seen by me at least 3 times. The one constant was the fog, which makes every explanation more uncertain. Which is why I ended up asking the question I still ask. Was I being watched by someone trying to choose me, or did the fog invent a figure for me to mistake as intent? I drove the same stretch again a few weeks later during daylight, just to see if my memory had been tricking me. In ordinary light, the roadside is ordinary. Scrub, guardrails, the same distant Pacific line, the same little pullouts. Nothing there says, stand here and be seen. Nothing there explains the ability to be in the middle of the lane and then, 20 minutes later, at the shoulder without anyone walking a physical distance between the 2 points. The rational brain looks for measurable causes. Intoxication, sleep deprivation, a story that repairs itself with daylight. But my palms still remembered the cold metal of the bumper and the hollowed-out shape where something had met something else and left a scar. At night I still sometimes feel it. Not the dent, not the figure. The small private panic of being in a place that has no easy map. Fog compresses distances and makes you less sure of your decisions. Was that a person? Did I brake long enough? Should I have called someone? The worst feeling is the one where you realize the thing you most trusted, your eyesight, has been compromised, and that everything you thought was real might have been a neat projection. And then a memory of the deputy taking my report resurfaces to show me that reality is stubborn. A paper trail, a photograph of the dent, a signature on a form. Not proof of anything supernatural, not a verdict. Just evidence that something happened, and we still can't call it by a comfortable name. There's one more detail from that night I haven't said yet, because it's the one that gnaws at me. After the hit, I watched the man step back off the road. Not flee, not hurry, just walk into the fog like a person who had been waiting for curtain call. He walked the way people walk, when they know a stage is theirs and the audience finally caught up. There was a small, almost ceremonial quality to his retreat. He didn't run. He didn't look at me again. He just folded into the grey as if the fog were his cloak and the darkness his home. Did he get into another car and leave? I saw no headlights pull away. Did he disappear into the trees? Maybe. But that final image, the man walking away like he had the right to be there, like he had been arranged into the scene on purpose, is the one I return to when I let the night swallow my logical explanations. I'm not saying he was something other than a man. I'm saying that the fog made him more than a man that night. It made his presence a question. I could end this segment there and let you imagine the answer you prefer. Prank, person, phenomenon. But I want you to carry the sense of being boxed in, because the next story takes that sensation a different direction. Instead of being cornered on a road, you'll meet someone trapped inside a route they thought they knew by heart, and that route starts turning on them in ways that make no sense. Between stories, there's always that pause where you reassess what you believe. I called 2 people after the Highway 101 thing. One friend who grew up on the coast, who told me fog was nothing more than weather, and maybe I needed rest, and another friend who said, without any drama, that sometimes the coast collects people whose stories don't fit, and that the fog is only the theatre that allows the oddities to be seen. Both were possible. Neither made me feel better. I let the memory sit for weeks. It takes time for the adrenaline to turn to curiosity. People forget the immediate fear and start cataloguing the anomalies like a scientist with a taste for the uncanny. I wrote down the details in a small notebook: time, location, the shape and depth of the dent, the deputy's badge number, the way the man looked at me. Writing helped me objectify it a little. It gave me a list I could file away, and lists are comforting because they imply completion. But lists lie too. They make you think you've accounted for the variables when really you've only gathered evidence for the unease. A week after the hit, I took the car to a mechanic to see if the dent could be popped out. He leaned on it, grunted, and said it would come out with a little heat and pounding. He couldn't account for the absence of paint transfer. He suggested maybe the other vehicle had been covered in tar or mud. That was possible, I thought. I wanted something plausible. He fixed the dent. After that, every time I ran my hand over that spot, I was met with smooth metal again, which made the memory less tactile and more a matter of thought. You'd think that would make the whole thing less important. Instead, what it did was turn the dent into something private, a scar I remembered that others couldn't see. I tell you this with the kind of attention that makes people ask, "So did you ever see him again?" The answer is no, I never saw that man standing in the lane again. I still wonder whether my avoidance or something else kept us from meeting. Did we both play our parts in some quiet choreography of a foggy night? Or was he a sign that the fog has a taste for people who are alone and tired and driving too far into the night? Either way, I have the dent, the report, and the remembered shape of eyes that seem to weigh me. That is the first story. Now imagine that same fog not on the road but inside the trees, compressed around the trunks, hanging like breath. Imagine being a runner who knows every inch of a 3-mile loop, only to find that the loop is growing while your body insists it is standing still. That's what the second story is about. It's the kind of fear that builds slowly, the kind that eats away trust in your own feet. The runner's account is not mine. It belongs to a college friend of someone I used to train with, a kid who was senior the spring he told us about it. He was disciplined, the kind of person who ran to erase stress, who used familiar routes like a reset button. The loop he ran was a 3-mile circuit through campus woods, the kind of trail that feels personal, because you've worn it down with your footsteps and your hours of rewind and repeat. It was spring break when the fog rolled in thick and early. He remembers thinking it was odd, a dense veil at midday. He laced up and decided to do his loop anyway because routines are anchors. The first mile was normal enough, the crunch of packed soil, the smell of damp leaves, the steady beat of his breath. But somewhere between the second and the third mile, his watch, an accurate GPS model he trusted, started to act up. He glanced down and for a second thought his eyes were failing him. The numbers ticked forward even as he slowed at an intersection to catch his breath. The distance counter climbed as if his feet were still moving, even when he had stopped to stretch. He laughed it off to himself at first. Technology glitches, batteries fail. But then the path looked wrong. At the turn that normally takes you back toward the dorms, there was a stand of trees that seemed denser, leaves hung lower like curtains. He took the turn, and the path felt longer. His soles slapped the earth with the same rhythm, but the trail extended like a rubber band. He told himself to slow down, to breathe, to let it pass. He told himself to trust his memory of where he was. But trust is easy to say when you're not listening to a low, continuous sound that presses the air around your ears. A droning hum that might be a distant generator or a bird's broken call, but which matched the cadence of his steps as if it were made to track him. The sound followed. If he sped up, the drone sped. If he slowed, it softened but didn't fade. It kept pace with him in a way that felt deliberate. He tried to trick it, sprinting a short stretch and hiding behind a thick trunk until his lungs burned. The sound did not falter. That's when the nerves start to sharpen and the brain begins inventing things to cover the blank spots. He considered a prank, someone with a speaker hidden in the bushes. He scanned for wires, for batteries, for anything that justified the impossible intimacy of the noise. He found nothing. Then there was the moment he stopped, actually stopped, planted his feet, and watched his watch tick up like a metronome. The GPS said his distance had increased while his body stood motionless. He remembers his skin crawling because the numbers did not lie. The device tracked movement in a way that made sense to modern logic, but his feet told a different story. How do you reconcile the literal arithmetic of a smartwatch with the calluses on your soles and the smell of wet earth in your nose? He pushed on, wanting finish lines, wanting the safety of a dormitory door. The woods stretched thinner. At the trailhead, he expected to see the gaggle of students who usually loitered there, the bikes chained to the posts, the sign with faded warnings about poison oak. Instead, there was a shape at the exit that made him forget how to breathe, a silhouette so tall it bent the idea of human height. He froze. He talks about it now with a grimace that suggests he is riding the edges of a memory he would rather erase. The figure was at least 7 feet tall, a dark vertical against the grey background, swaying slowly like a tree in wind that didn't exist. No face, no clear limbs, just a presence that seemed to erase the detail around it, as if reality thinned where it stood. The drone stopped the instant his eyes found that outline. Sound and sight married and then fell away. He ran. Not a measured jog home, but a panic-fueled sprint where every footfall was desperate and the path demanded to be trusted again. By the time he reached the dorms, he was shaking. He told his parents and roommates about it the way people tell a dream they're embarrassed to describe. They offered normal explanations: misperception, exhaustion, someone in a costume, a large person on stilts. None of them accounted for the GPS ticking upwards while he stopped, and none explained the way the sound matched the cadence of his breathing. He still thinks about it. At first he was ashamed to tell anyone. Later he said it to a few friends, and then to me, because the fog had become the common thread linking things that made no good sense. The memory sits with him like a bruise you can't show anyone. You can point to it and say it exists, but the mark is not pretty enough to force sympathy. What I took from his story was the way fog can turn a known lane into a labyrinth. It's not just about blocking sight, it's about making maps worthless. When your route becomes longer on your watch, and a sound knows your pace better than your own ears, you are left questioning the ground beneath you. He told me that after the run he stopped trusting the loop. He avoided the woods for months, then began running on roads where the markers were obvious and the lights stayed the same. But the memory lingered, gnawing at the part of him that trusted his body. Who wants to live with the sense that the ground can lie to you? I sat with that for a time, thinking about how similar that panic was to the kind I experienced on 101. Both begin with a familiar path and end with a present that refuses to be simple. Both leave physical proof, a dent, a watch's data, that complicates the story of whether you simply imagined it. That pattern was the thing that made me collect these accounts and string them together. It's not just coincidence. It's the fog doing its work, compressing space, shredding time, inviting the uncanny into ordinary life. When my friend was ready, he agreed to let me record his account in more detail. He pulled up his running app and showed me the route and the timestamp and the spike, where the watch kept adding distance while he had stopped. He didn't know how to interpret the numbers any more than I did, but seeing them made the story less spectral and more stubbornly measurable. That's the one thing the fog hates, being measured. I could tell you the rest of his day, the way his roommates joked at first, the way his parents insisted he maybe drink more water, the way the campus shrank in his mind. But the key point is the way the forest rearranged itself, and how his own technology corroborated something his eyes and feet were trying to deny. That kind of contradiction lives with you the way a pebble lives in a shoe, constant, annoying, and impossible to ignore. And so we come to the third story, which is the one that will probably make you feel the most exposed. It starts on water, not road or trail, 2 experienced kayakers heading out onto Willipa Bay on a grey morning. My friend Edwin was with the narrator. They were used to fog on the estuary. They had been out there many times. Water has a way of lying too, but differently. It hides depth, muffles sound, and makes distances feel like suggestions rather than facts. On that morning, the fog did something else entirely. It created movement that didn't belong to anything visible, the sound of oars cutting water in a rhythm like someone rowing right beside them, only no one was there. I won't dive into that one yet. I'll save the least tidy of the 3 for its proper place, because it needs space to breathe and for you to feel the slow reveal properly. Right now, let the image of the tall silhouette at the trailhead sit with you and the memory of a dented bumper that no amount of logic could explain. Imagine fog as a filter that strips away the things that help us trust our senses. Imagine what it does to the rest of your life when the things you depend on, numbers on a watch, the shape of a road, the sound of another boat, begin to betray you. Before I go on, a reminder, these are true accounts as reported to me or as I lived them. I present them as memories and reported facts, not as a verdict about what truly happened. The purpose here is to explore the experiences and the strange evidence left behind, not to claim supernatural causation. Keep that in your mind as we move forward. The fog is a neutral actor. What it reveals depends on what you bring into it. With that said, let's get back on the trail. The runner's memory keeps circling that next beat, the moment where the drone locked on and the figure waited, and he still hasn't found a satisfactory explanation. He's not alone in that. Lots of people have experiences that, when stripped of the dramatic language and the urge to sensationalize, amount to the same slow erosion of certainty, an ordinary context, a sensory oddity that can't be dismissed, and the lingering aftermath that shapes decisions for years. That's what makes these stories stick. I'll pick up the kayaker's morning on Willipa Bay next, because the water story folds in a physical trace you can't ignore, footprints appearing where there should be none, leading directly from the tide line to an abandoned rowboat pulled up on the sand, and the discomfort of two people who know their craft and yet cannot explain what they heard. For now, imagine the fog as a living screen that both hides and stages moments. Imagine being on a road, in the woods or on the water, and realizing that the rules you thought governed those places are not holding up. Imagine the fog as not just weather, but as a way to make the world ask questions you don't have answers for. I'll pick up the kayaker's morning on Willipa Bay now. This one happened about 6 years ago, and it still sits with me like a bruise that occasionally throbs when I smell salt and diesel. Edwin and the narrator, who was me in this case, knew that bay. We'd launched there a dozen times, knew the currents well enough to be complacent, knew how fog curls over the estuary like steam rising off a pot. It was the kind of place where the water remembers you, the sound of your blades, the rhythm of your stroke, the familiar lulling breath of a place that usually rewards respect with predictability. We pushed off a little after dawn. The world was a white bowl. The fog sat low and heavy, and the shoreline looked like the edge of the world bleeding into nothing. The air tasted of brackish water and marsh. There were other noises, gulls, distant motors, but they were muffled as if someone had put a blanket over the whole place and asked it to keep quiet. We paddled in a small, confident arc, talking too quietly because our voices seemed loud in that density. Edwin half joked about ghosts of fishermen past. I laughed because that is what you do when you're comfortable and the environment is trying to be atmospheric. Then we heard the rhythm. It started as a suggestion. A steady, regular sound just off our port side, the kind of soft splash a scull makes when someone rows rhythmically. We both looked over, expecting to pick up a hull or a pair of oars, another boat keeping pace. The fog had a way of hiding things until they were practically touching you, so we leaned toward the sound like moths to a porch light. Nothing. No hull, no silhouette, just that steady stroke, close enough to feel like a presence but distant enough that we could not see it. At first we thought it was another kayaker who'd chosen a different line. I called out, a small cautious greeting, thinking I'd get a shout back, maybe a wave. Silence. I turned the kayak to follow the sound. The noise tracked with us. We cut our motors. Our kayaks don't have engines, but I mean we stopped the casual chatter and synchronized our paddling to see if the sound would change. It didn't. The rowing rhythm matched our speed, whether we drifted or accelerated. When we tried to vector away from it, angling toward the mouth of the bay, toward a patch of grey that might be open water, the sound stayed pinned at the same bearing, as if whatever was making it was locked to our location. Edwin frowned, the kind of frown that comes from someone who measures danger by experience rather than panic. He's the sort of person who would check for a tow line if a boat suddenly rode us like a shadow. He scanned the fog with his eyes, the way you sweep a room for a source of a sound. For a moment we saw a shape, a dark wedge through the white, like the blunt back of a rowboat sliding into view for half a second. Then it was gone. The pattern repeated, a glimpse, a pause, the rowing sound continuing without any change in intensity or direction. I remember thinking of the simplest things. Could it be a crab boat anchored just out of sight, oars hitting the water as someone moved around the stern? Could it be fishermen in a skiff who had slipped into the fog and then vanished behind a bank? Those are reasonable options. We tried to force them to be true because the mind prefers workable choices. We changed course, we slowed, we called out. The audio didn't respond. If anything, it grew more insistent, a metronome pressed right against the edges of our hearing. We decided to head for shore. The plan was practical. If there was someone else out there, better to not be isolated in the middle of a blank expanse. We kept the oars low, the hulls close, moving with deliberate strokes that kept us near one another. As we angled for a small beach, the fog thinned just enough to allow a wall of pale to reveal a shoreline we knew well. Ribbon grass, a wash of pebbles, driftwood logs. We leaned forward to see what would be waiting, thinking maybe now we would meet the other rower as they came in. The sound stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Like someone had cut a wire. That silence landed on us like a slap. For a second, it felt like being pulled out of a dream. We beached the kayaks and climbed onto the slick rocks. Our shoes squeaked against wet wood. We carried our boats a little way inland, because the tide can play tricks, and because we'd been trained to get gear above the high water line when fog makes the light deceptive. We were careful, methodical, the sort of routine that should have calmed us. Instead, every small thing felt amplified. The absence of the sound felt louder than the sound itself. Then we saw the footprints. They were fresh and human and impossibly clear. Bare feet, toes splayed slightly as if the person had been walking out of the water. They led from the foam line, up over the strand of damp sand, and disappeared into the low-slung scrub that backs the beach. The prints were saturated with water. You could see the rims of sand pressed by heels, the slight dragging of toes on one of the prints, as if the walker had adjusted their balance. There were maybe 10 or 12 impressions heading inland, and then they ended where the ground softened into marsh grass. The stride was adult-sized. The prints were close set, as if the person was tired or trying to be deliberate. We both stopped. The world narrowed down to wet sand, and the indentations of feet that should have had an owner standing right there. There was nothing else, no second set of prints that would suggest two people, no drag marks of equipment, no overturned rowboat nearby indicating a struggle or a sudden abandonment. Everything suggested someone had walked ashore, barefoot from the surf, and then simply vanished into the fog and reeds like a figure stepping behind a curtain. Edwin crouched and ran his fingers through one of the prints. He's pragmatic. He was trying to look for a clue. He breathed out a string of hypotheses. Fisherman's path? Someone getting towed? Large driftwood moved by tide? But his voice had that thin edge, which happens when you're trying not to admit that you've been unsettled. I walked the line of footprints with my shoes on the damp sand and felt a small private rebellion. Missing things have a way of making you a detective against your own fear. We followed them a short distance, careful because the marshy edge made the prints less obvious and because the tall grass looked like it could hide anything. At the point where the footprints disappeared into the grass, we held our position and searched. No voice, no movement, only fog and the distant low burble of water against a hull somewhere out in the bay. Then the float, a dark curve of wood against pale peat, appeared as the fog shifted. It sat half buried in wrack and kelp at the mouth of a small inlet, an old wooden rowboat pulled up above the high tide mark. It was small, blackened by water and use, the kind of craft you don't see much anymore unless someone's into old skiffs. It had been dragged up on the shore and left there, oars not in sight, no life jacket, no clothing, not a modern vessel with bright plastic gear. Just a quiet, somber boat that looked like it had weathered a few seasons and been used again last night. We approached it cautiously. From a distance it could have been someone else's possession left by tide or time. Up close, it was clearly been recently used. The inside of the hull was wet. You could see water still beaded in the seams. The bow had the imprint of a rope. There were no obvious items like clothing or gear laid out to say, "Owner left this moment ago," but the fresh wetness suggested recent contact. Seaweed stuck to the keel in thin ribbons. The boat's paint was scuffed in one area, as if oarlocks had scraped through repeatedly. There was enough there to suggest that someone, had been managing this rowboat not long before we arrived. Edwin looked at me, and the question in his eyes was not theatrical. It was a basic human question: where did the person go? We were trained by miles on water to check all the reasonable boxes. Maybe someone had pulled the boat up and gone inland to use the restroom, to hike, to meet someone. Maybe they'd caught a ride, maybe they'd fallen asleep and we'd find them wrapped in a sleeping bag with a thermos. Reasonable things that let you pretend the world hasn't misaligned. We moved quickly, scanning the edge of the scrub, calling out in small, practical phrases. "Hello, you all right? Anyone here?" The voice in the fog doesn't carry, so the replies, if there were replies, were swallowed. We pushed through a tangled stretch of grass that dampened our shoes and followed the prints the final distance. The trail ended at a clump of alders where the footprints disappeared, as if the walker had stepped into shadow and been taken. There was no limp, no sign of stumbling, no torn clothing, just a tidy end to a tidy set of steps. We stayed a while. We wanted to find an ordinary explanation, the kind our hands can touch and our brains can catalogue. We looked for evidence: cigarette butts, personal effects, a dropped hat. Nothing. The boat sat there like an unsent letter. At that point, fear was not cinematic. It was a practical realization that we didn't have the basic information to make a safe call. Who was out there? Did they need help? Had someone disappeared from their craft? Edwin considered wandering further into the marsh in search of signs, but the thought of stepping alone into a bank of fog where you cannot see more than a few feet felt like giving away a measured precaution for a rumor. It felt unwise. Two experienced paddlers choosing to step back instead of pressing forward was its own kind of decision, the kind that turns fear into an action plan. So we left. We carried the boat concern with us like a weight in our dry bags. We called local contacts, left messages with folks who know that shoreline better than either of us, and told the simplest version of the story to people who asked. People offered explanations, the familiar lineup: prank, a fisherman who wandered inland, some old boat washed up and recently wetted by tide. Those things were possible. They were also not satisfying. We did not stake out the beach. We did not wait for the fog to lift and reveal a human figure blinking in the sunlight. We wanted answers, but we were not curious enough to trade our safety for them. That's a key distinction. Curiosity is a hunger. Survival is a rule. We are not the same person when that rule is engaged. In the days after, Edwin and I compared notes, tightened timelines. We checked tide charts. The tide that morning had been low but outgoing, which made the idea of a boat being pulled above the high water mark plausible if someone had landed intentionally. The footprints were in the sand strip above the wetline, which suggests the person stepped ashore and moved inland rather than being washed up. I replay the scene often. The rhythm of the oars, the sudden stop of sound, the prints leading inland like clues from a story that didn't want a conclusion. I keep catching myself trying to press the event into a simple category. The simplest explanations have the comfort of being testable. Call Harbour Patrol, see if anyone reported a missing boater, check with local fishermen. We did make a few calls. No one confirmed a missing person matching those details. No local authority told us we checked. We are left with the scene and our own reticence to escalate what might have been an ordinary human story into something larger. Years later, the memory fits into the pattern that runs through the other two stories. The fog creates a theatre where perception and reality don't align neatly. In the first story, you have a dent that contradicts your hypothesis of hallucination. In the second, your GPS numbers step ahead of your feet. In this one, you have footprints that are stubbornly physical and a boat that is obviously recently used, but no owner to reconcile the physical evidence with a rational narrative. All three leave behind objects or data that say in effect as something happened, while the human context to make sense of it is missing. I've tried to imagine rational scenarios that respect the evidence. Someone taking a rowboat ashore to relieve themselves, then getting picked up by a vehicle? Possible. A prankster? Possible. A fisherman who forgot their way back? Possible. A person in distress who left on foot? Also possible. None of those options feels neat enough to soothe the sense of being watched by a seam of weather. that transforms ordinary environments into rooms where the rules are slightly different. Of course, it is much easier to accept a tidy, mundane explanation and move on. Most people do. We like solutions that fit into the space of our lives without changing plans. But these three stories kept gnawing because they all share that uncomfortable crossroads: physical evidence that insists on being real, and circumstances that deprive us of the human narrative that would normalize it. Dent, GPS blip, footprints, and a boat, all anchors that push back against the idea that we only imagined these things. There's another layer here that I haven't said yet, and it's about the specific quality of fog. It not only hides and muffles, it also reassigns scale. On 101, it made the man seem simultaneously near and unreal, compressing distance so he could be seen at multiple points without the intervening steps. For the runner, it stretched the trail until the path betrayed the trust his feet had in it. On Willipa Bay, the fog seemed to provide cover, not just for hiding, but for things to move without being noticed. The oars that made sound, but belonged to no visible craft. The footprints that walked from surf into scrub and then stopped as if somebody had turned off a lamp. What do we make of that? I don't have an answer that I can offer with the conviction of a forensic report or a documentary conclusion. The stories resist being corralled into a single tidy theory. They occupy that unsettling zone where the natural and the unaccountable touch. For me, the tension isn't whether something supernatural occurred, it's that the fog changes the way evidence behaves. It suggests that ordinary objects, people, boats, a bumper, can be rearranged into a scene that refuses to be pinned down by ordinary logic. I think about the long-term effects, too. After the 101 incident, I talked differently about driving at night. After the runner's story, I avoided some trails for a while. After Willipa Bay, I checked the tide charts more carefully and watched the skim of low clouds over the water. These events make small conservative changes to behavior because fear does not always demand grand gestures. It asks for small, slow adjustments. That's the real influence. The way your map shifts, the routes you avoid, the corners of the world you no longer assume are safe. You can file these incidents under anecdote and be satisfied, or you can acknowledge that there was a thing that happened and it left traces that are awkward to explain. You can accept that sometimes weather is weather, and sometimes weather becomes a stage on which weird, hard-to-accept things happen. Either way, one truth remains. I remember the sensory details. That's all a witness can promise. The dent felt cold under my palm. The watch numbers glowed at my friend's wrist. The footprints had the clear press of human weight. Those are stubborn facts. If you ask me what I believe, I'll give you the cautious version. I believe in evidence. I believe in daylight rationales. I believe in probable causes and Occam's razor. I also believe that some things are real and unresolved. The fog doesn't care what you decide. It moves in and out, a neutral force that rearranges our ability to perceive. What we call meaning afterward is always human. That's why these stories matter. They force us to sit with uncertainty and to notice how we choose to explain what we cannot comfortably resolve. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with 3 mornings and nights that do not add up neatly. It leaves us with a dent without paint transfer, with GPS that increments while feet are still, and with a rowboat that sits wet and empty above the tide line with footprints leading from the sea. It leaves us with a fog that in all 3 cases performs the same trick. It isolates, it muffles, and it creates opportunities for the uncanny to slip in alongside the real. The takeaway isn't that the world has grown more haunted, it's that our assumptions about continuity, about sight, sound, and proximity, are fragile when the weather conspires to rearrange them. Before I go, I want to say this. I'm not trying to sell you on ghosts or to scare you into thinking the world is secretly dangerous at every fog bank. These are true accounts as remembered and reported. They are offered without verdict. My job here is to tell them in a way that honors the sensory truth of the moments and the lingering human unease that followed. Whether you chalk them up to tricks of perspective, temporal anomalies, or something that resists tidy categorization, the stories are still worth telling because they highlight a recurring human experience. That moment when what you rely on to know the world fails you. If you've sat in a car that felt boxed in by a person you couldn't explain, if you've had your device disagree with your feet, or if you've ever found more evidence than sense would allow, Tell me about it in the comments. Which of these three would you never go back to the scene of? Which one unsettled you most? Share your fog stories, and if you want more accounts like these, the kind that let facts and mystery sit beside each other, subscribe and join the conversation. Next time the fog rolls in, don't assume it's only weather. Keep your hands on the wheel, your eyes sharp, and your mind open to the possibility that sometimes the world will give you something you cannot easily explain. That's the place these stories live, not in a conclusion, but in the pause between what we expect and what we find.